what's up? Back at you with another video. Ernst Roets here is with Dr. Jordan Peterson. It's a lengthy video about an hour and 40 minutes. And so we're just going to be listening to the first 5 minutes. Y'all would remember when I mentioned that the Daily Wire, that squad, Jordan Peterson is somebody in the squad. So no surprise that Ernst Roets would go from Ben Shapiro to Jordan Peterson. Really, it's regrettable that Jordan Peterson still finds himself in this stable. I remember when he came in, his role, his alignment with the right was his view on gender, his opposition to calling people by their pronouns, or it being law to force people to call certain people certain things. He says he should do it if he wants to. And so the Daily Wire loved him for those views. And so he's been with them for quite some time now. So let's listen to what he has to do with Ernst Roets. The title of the video, if I haven't read it, South Africa, What the West Needs to Learn. Dr. Ernst Roets. This is episode number 538 on Jordan B. Peterson. Let's listen to about 5 or 10 minutes of this.
I mentioned this story about the vow that was made in 1838. And he went to negotiate with the Zulu king, King Dingaan. They signed a treaty. The king said, we need to celebrate this, but leave your weapons outside. And so during the celebration, the Zulu king chanted, kill the wizards, and they slaughtered them. We need to retaliate. We need to attack back. And so they had a commando of about 300 to 400 people. They were completely surrounded by about 12,000. A man named Sarel Salia, he was the religious leader, and he said, we need to make a vow to God. Some people say that's the origin story of our people.
Let's flip to the modern time. What was the relationship between the apartheid state per se and this notion of separate homelands?
The argument was that South Africa should be thought of as Europe. The single biggest problem in South Africa is the triangle of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Ironically, they've gotten to a point where they can only think about inequality.
It looks to me like the cost of innovation is inequality. Okay, now your book is entitled Kill the Boer. There's a reason for that. Hello, everybody. I've watched over a very long period of time the political and economic situation in South Africa both heat up and destabilize, and that's taken somewhat of an accelerating turn in the last few years. And because of that, I've become increasingly interested in delving more deeply into the history of South Africa to understand the context and then also the political situation on the ground in that country now. And I came across the work of Dr. Ernst Roets, who wrote this book called Kill the Boer, this book, which was published in 2018. Now, he's also a filmmaker. He made a film called Tainted Heroes, which is about the apartheid era in 2016, and another one called Disrupted Land. And I hoped to talk to Dr. Roets about South Africa, about its history, and about its current situation, and about hopes and concerns for the future. And that's exactly what we did. And so the first thing I wanted to do was to delve a little bit into the history of the origin of South Africa, because there's a narrative in the West that the evil white Europeans came to a land dominated by black Africans and colonized it in their brutal and murderous fashion. And while any territorial dispute has its bloody edge, let's say, but the truth of the matter is that the settlement of South Africa is a hell of a lot more complex than that, and that the two primary racial groups that exist there today weren't the original inhabitants of the land, whether they're black or white. And so just knowing that is useful. And we spent the first half, really, of the podcast talking about the history of the settlement of South Africa. The original people there were Bushmen, who aren't particularly related genetically to the Bantu, the black people who live there now, and obviously not to the Europeans. So
why are the Khoi separated from the black people on this continent? Are the Khoi not black? Are the Khoi being considered some kind of colored? Is that it? Is that what's being done here? The Khoi are being considered to be colored. And so the claim is that South Africa actually belongs to the colored people. They were here first, so it's neither blacks nor whites. It's actually the coloreds. Is that a settling meeting point where people are trying to bring us?
Not to the Europeans. So the the situation with regards to ethnicity and race in South Africa is a lot more complicated than it appears on the surface. And so, well, that's what we're trying to puzzle out in this podcast. So join me and my guest, Dr. Ernst Roets, for that discussion. So this is likely to be an unsettling conversation, so we might as well dive right in. The first thing I think that people who are watching and listening should know is a somewhat more detailed history of the settlement patterns in South Africa, because the presumption, first of all, what most people in the West know about South Africa, you could put in a very small thimble with enough room left over for another thimble, and that includes me. And so it's not like I studied that in high school, for example. And so people know nothing about South Africa, like really nothing. And they certainly don't know anything about its settlement patterns. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose people use the analog of the European settlement of the Americas, which is also a very complex story. I mean, by the time the Pilgrims got to the eastern coast of the United States, there are estimates that 95% of the Native Americans had already died from measles, smallpox, mumps, etc. Mm-hmm. And so the settlement story is extremely complex, but it's even more complex in South Africa, and they're not the same.
So good. He's paralleling this with the arrival of settlers in the Americas and them finding people already there. So there were people looking at, was it an Italian man, the one who's said to have actually discovered North America? I think so. And so as he arrived, there were Indians probably watching. That's what they call the red or native Indians.
They're not the same. So could you enlighten everyone who's watching and listening about the settlement patterns, the relationship between the land and the Europeans and the Black Africans, and let's just lay that out so we know where we stand first.
Well, let me firstly say thank you very much for speaking with me. And I can say with great self-assurance that a lot of people in South Africa would be very happy to hear that you are interested in what's happening in South Africa.
Interested in and terrified by.
Well, hopefully we can flesh out a lot of that.
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson is terrified by what is happening in South Africa. He's terrified by peace and well-being of white people. He's terrified by prosperity. He's terrified by the land where people come to invest. What is he terrified about? There are people touring South Africa right now on holiday. What are they afraid of?
Well, hopefully we can flesh out a lot of that.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right to say that the history of, or the patterns of land ownership and the history leading to this is complex. And we can do an entire interview just about that because there were so many events that happened in South Africa. Broadly speaking, the people who live in South Africa who are of European descent, such as myself, arrived in 1652. That was the settlement when the Dutch East India Company arrived in Cape Town, or what is today Cape Town, to start a refreshment station for ships traveling around Africa to trade with the East.
This looks like it's a repetition. Sounds like what he told to Ben Shapiro.
It was initially the Dutch, and they were then joined by Germans and French especially, but some other Europeans as well. And we sometimes call them the Proto-Afrikaners because the Afrikaner people became a people. Obviously, it's not just one singular event and then you are a people, but it happened over time when we developed our own language and culture in Africa. So that was about 400 years ago. But what also happened in South Africa in terms of the different black groups, if you could use that term, who live in South Africa, is we had and still have what is called the Khoi and the San. A lot of people know it as the Bushmen. That's how they're also known. A lot of them prefer to be called the Bushmen. People know them from the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy and so forth. And they are the true indigenous people. If you want to say who are the indigenous people of South Africa, it's the Khoi and the San.
I asked the question earlier. This leaning on the Khoi from the introduction, where was it going to lead us? This is where it leads us now, to say that it's the coloreds. So if the Khoi indigenously lived on the land, what part of the land? Are you talking about the African continent? Are you talking about Southern Africa? South Africa? Which borders were there then? Aren't we talking about the arrival of colonizers, settlers in Africa? Isn't that the entire story? Arriving to an entire black people on their continent. The Chinese people have their continent. The European people have a place that is God-given, that is theirs. The Indian people have their place. You are saying the black people indigenously inhabited which land? Not South Africa? Maybe some parts of Africa we have a claim to them, but South Africa in particularly belongs to coloureds. Ooh.
Lived pretty much all over South Africa. They've been there for tens of thousands of years.
They're a very ethnic and genetically separate group, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of genetic and ethnic diversity in Africa,
Yes,
more
yes.
than in the rest of the world by a lot. And the Bushmen, those people are very distinct. In fact, I've read that genetically they're more akin to Asians than they are to black Africans.
I've heard that too.
Yeah.
This is where it's going. So Asians are actually the indigenous people of South Africa. You understand? So even if black people wanted to say, hey, but the Khoi are our people as well, why are we being completely excluded from the story? They're saying, hey, can't even have the Khoi. They belong to the Asians. Jordan Peterson. This is why I decided to stop watching the Daily Wire. I just realized that these are rich and greedy men. They speak for their stomach and their wealth and their high status and high positions. I realized that about Jordan Peterson. I really, at some point, believe that he's a man who is incorruptible, especially when he also started speaking about Jesus, crying, talking about God, talking about reading the Bible. People were excited thinking that he's going to become Christian. And I was watching during that time thinking, wow, a man who is believing Christ while he's a professional psychiatrist. Is he a psychologist? Yeah, I think he's a psychologist. So this man surely will have it all put together. But it seemed it was a weird, spooky, new age Christ that he was talking about. People started hearing that, he's talking about Jesus' consciousness, not Jesus, the actual Son of God, not the prophesied to be coming, the one who lived the life, died as he was prophesied, was resurrected as prophesied, to be lifted to heaven, to judge on Judgment Day. They are talking about Christ consciousness. Christ consciousness does not include or does not perceive the possibility of being judged by an external God, because this God is in you, so you can exonerate yourself from sin, because it's just the consciousness. It's not a Jesus who really cares for you to keep his Father's word. It's your mind. You are the Jesus. So that's why I was like, oh, Lord, we will go to hell here following men we think are intelligent and coming to Christ. And so I decided to come off all of this completely.
I've heard that too.
Yeah. So I'm just laying that out, not to make any genetic claim of any sort, just so everybody's clear about that, but just to know that these things are extremely complicated, and all so-called black people aren't the same by any stretch of the imagination, any more than they're probably less similar from a cultural and genetic perspective than Europeans are to one another.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I think you can make that case pretty bluntly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of diversity in Africa.
And I'm very happy that you recognize this, because a lot of people don't.
So all those black people are the same.
But there are also groups like the South African government who would like people to believe that all black people are the same, because that's their way of organizing as a collective on the basis of race.
Yeah. Well, that way you can make the racial story, the racial oppression story, for example, a lot simpler than it actually is.
Yes.
Okay, so is there any estimates for the number of people, of Bushman people that were there, say, in the 1600s? And how densely populated was South Africa? And what part of Africa exactly are we talking about? Like, Africa's a wallopingly big continent, despite the Mercator projection. And so, and the people who Americans think of as black, they occupy Africa south of the Sahara Desert, but fundamentally north of where South Africa is. Like, how far up were the Bushmen? How far to the north were the Bushmen the predominant human population in the 1600s?
Well, that's a very important point. So they occupied. There were several thousands. I don't know if there were 100,000. I'm not sure. We can check those numbers.
Yeah.
But they lived pretty much all over South Africa, and they lived more to the eastern part, which is important because the eastern part is much more fertile land. It's much more humid, and that's where the most productive farming land is, and so forth.
Right.
The western part is arid. It's more deserts and dry, and so forth.
So they lived mostly in the east.
Yes, but they don't anymore, and that's important because so if you go to the eastern parts, like the Drakensberg, you would find the cave paintings of the Khoi and the San, but they don't live there anymore because they were pushed out by groups coming in from the north, who it has become a controversial term, although I don't know what the appropriate term then would be, by the Bantu people. So the word Bantu is a word that means people. It just means people.
Like that's typical anthropologically. Most tribes refer to themselves as the humans, as opposed to everyone else who aren't the humans.
Exactly. So they've been known as the Bantu-speaking groups, but today it's controversial to use that term.
Why is that?
Because it's a term that refers to black people. And I think some people have used the term in the context of making derogatory remarks or something to that effect.
I see. Okay.
So, but that's how they were known historically. And that's the Zulus and the Xhosas and the different groups that we know in South Africa today.
And they came down from the north and pushed out the Bushmen.
The north, and they pushed out the Bushmen.
Right.
Yes.
Now, also the Bushmen, from what I understand, and like I don't know lots about the Bushmen either, although what I do.
So we are now hearing what parts of Africa they are defining now. They are not defining borders as yet. So this is pre-borders, this is pre-colonization, and now they are allocating where others originally were. So if you're South African, your claim is Zimbabwe, Zambia, or somewhere central. The Khoi, who are Asian, are the first pickers of this land. These are the white men talking.
What I do know about them is that they were basically hunters and gatherers and trackers, and that they were very sophisticated at that. Right? They had those little lightweight bows and arrows and the poison darts, and they're very good at running down prey, right? And they can live where no one else can live. But also, they weren't agriculturalists, from my understanding, and there were no places where the Bushmen produced like cities or dense population centers.
Correct. And they are fairly small also, which is one of the reasons when the bigger tribes came in from the north and there was conflict between these groups, they were pushed out. They were not able to take a stance against the Zulu people, who are typically a strong nation.
Right, and very, yes, well-armed comparatively
very speaking. Militaristic, yes.
Right. The Bushmen have those little bows and arrows with their poison darts, but those don't make very effective weapons of war.
So basically, we are hearing that the black people arrived as invaders as well and displaced the originals. Ladies and gentlemen, historians, is this a true account of what has happened? And really, what dynamic does it have? The Afrikaner who arrives now and displaces the Khoi and displaces the blacks and enslaves them and works them and builds a country on their labor. That story, the rest of it, the justice for it, the reparations for that, should there be any? Or are you saying we also invaded some people and we never gave them reparations, so screw you, you're done? That's the story of a black person.
Of war, partly because the poison is long-acting.
Yes,
you know, and for all those people who think, by the way, that the Bushmen were like peaceful agrarian communists and that there was no conflict amongst them, let's say, prior to the Bantu or the Europeans, the most common, if I remember correctly, the most common pathway to death for a Bushman man is through murder. So you can use those darts on other people quite effectively if there's a feud. I also know that the Bushmen, because they lived in small tribal groups, they didn't evolve a real judicial system, and often their disputes would turn murderous. And so in some of these areas where the Bantus, for example, came down, the Bushmen would use the Bantu judicial system, which was more advanced, as a means of mediating their own disputes. So I just want to bring that up to put to rest any suspicions that the Bushmen, for example, were Rousseau noble savages and that everything was peaceful before civilization came along. It's like, that's not how the world works, even a little bit.
So even the Bushmen themselves were savages. And so the blacks who displaced them displaced savages. And the whites who came and displaced both displaced savages who were fighting each other all along.
Okay, so in the 1650s, the Europeans came to the very southern tip of Africa, and that was primarily a consequence of the trading routes because people had to sail around the Horn. Right, and they set up this settlement as a refreshment station, you said, for the sailors, and that would be the European sailors who were starting to trade in India and so forth.
Exactly, yes.
And in Asia.
And also to service the ships, building ships, repairing ships, and so forth, yes. So that they started there in 1652. Eventually, they had what we call the Vryburgers or the Freeburgers, which was that they were employees of the Dutch East India Company. Some of them were then released from their contracts so that they could become farmers, so that they could start developing an economy. And so there were some clashes with, for example, the Bushmen already there in the Cape between the Europeans and the Bushmen, but there was also examples of trading and cooperation and so forth.
Right, so that's similar to what happened in North America.
Yeah.
Like there were lots of peaceful and productive interactions between the natives and the Europeans, and it also depended on which Europeans. So the Cree in Canada were much more likely to ally with the English, for example, than with the French. And so these things were very common.
We had the same dynamics in South Africa with the Afrikaner people and the English as well, yes. But just to get to that point, it's unfortunate that thinking about history tends to overestimate or overemphasize the conflict and downplay the cooperation, because conflict is more newsworthy, you could say. So when we think about history, we think about war and conflict, but we forget the cooperation part. That's very important.
Right.
And so that was about the time when the Zulu people were settling in what is today KwaZulu-Natal, and that calls up people in what is the Eastern Cape, closer to where the Afrikaners or the Proto-Afrikaners were. And
so when did the Bantu start moving south? And why hadn't they done that before?
I'm not sure why they haven't done that before, but from what I know, there was conflict up north in Africa, and there was nomadic tribes and some groups.
So they were pushed down as a consequence of intertribal warfare in their own lands.
Yes.
It's still surprising, isn't it, that so much of Africa was essentially unsettled. I mean, I know the Bushmen were there, but there weren't very many of them. And it's also a lifestyle that can't support that huge a population. It's pre-agricultural lifestyle.
Yep.
So, I mean, there weren't very many human beings 100,000 years ago. So, okay. And so, all right. So the Europeans start settling in the southernmost.
Let me leave it right there. You will go. We're at 15 minutes, 16 seconds. So you'll just go hop onto the video and watch it there. Ladies and gentlemen, I wonder what it is that you are thinking. If these men are telling the truth, and if the world was indeed a land of conquest, a land of sin, a land of a mess at a particular time, it's the world in a state that did indeed need saving by Christ, for the Messiah, the owner of the world, to actually show up. If it was a bad state like that, we saw that violent past kind of ending around the world wars and the detonation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's when people said stop. So if you look back, our roughness is not too far behind us. We see evidence of it. As humanity, the blacks and the whites, all of us taking accountability for what happened at the hands of Hitler. That was humanity. It wasn't him alone. It was Nazi soldiers. It was the people of Germany who sat back and said, this is okay. So humans, white ones, black ones, who sold each other in slavery, who enslaved each other, who sold each other to white people across the Atlantic, who actually got transatlantic slave trade money. If that is our history, and Christ needed to come in, it was worse off some time back still. Is forgiveness and letting go and acceptance of reality something that we must look at the possibility of forgiving and letting go? On the other side of the coin is protesting until the end of time and claiming to be the victim in all of history. Can parts further back, like the slavery, be remembered but let go of in our hearts? The anger for it. Those who did not get enslaved. Those whose parents lived under apartheid but were never slapped, not once beaten, etc. Not violated in such ways. The discrimination is known. The teaching of Bantu education to black people so that they may not be as caught up as the rest of the world. Can those things be forgiven if you have an education today? If in your life you were born in 1990 and you managed to get an education, can you let go of the past? If you were dispossessed of land, if your predecessors were dispossessed, and now you've bought yourself some land in Midrand, can people buy land in Midrand? I heard they are renting it for 99 years. Ladies and gentlemen, hope you like, hope you comment, hope you share, you subscribe, and you consider forgiving and letting go. I will see you next time.